It is awful? Awful, he said. At that moment in the next room a child began to cry, probably it had fallen down. Darya Alexandrovna listened, and her face suddenly softened. She seemed to be pulling herself together for a few seconds, as though she did not know where she was, and what she was doing, and getting up rapidly, she moved towards the door. Well, she loves my child, he thought, noticing the change of her face at the child's cry. My child, how can she hate me? Dolly, one word more, he said, following her. If you come near me, I will call in the servants, the children. They may all know you are a scoundrel. I am going away at once, and you may live here with your mistress. And she went out, slamming the door. Stepan Arkadyevitch sighed, wiped his face, and with a subdued tread walked out of the room. Matvey says she will come round, but how? I don't see the least chance of it. Ah, oh, how horrible it is. And how vulgarly she shouted, he said to himself, remembering her shriek and the words scoundrel and mistress. And very likely the maids were listening. Horribly vulgar. Horrible. Stepan Arkadyevitch stood a few seconds alone, wiped his face, squared his chest, and walked out of the room. It was Friday, and in the dining room the German watchmaker was winding up the clock. Stepan Arkadyevitch remembered his joke about this punctual, bald watchmaker, that the German was wound up for a whole lifetime himself, to wind up watches, and he smiled. Stepan Arkadyevitch was fond of a joke. And maybe she will come round. That's a good expression, come round, he thought. I must repeat that. Matvey, he shouted. Arrange everything with Darya in the sitting room for Anna Arkadyevna, he said to Matvey when he came in. Yes, sir. Stepan Arkadyevitch put on his fur coat and went out onto the steps. You won't dine at home? Said Matvey, seeing him off. That's as it happens. But here's for the housekeeping, he said, taking 10 rubles from his pocketbook. That'll be enough. Enough or not enough, we must make it do, said Matvey, slamming the carriage door and stepping back onto the steps. Darya Alexandrovna, meanwhile, having pacified the child, and knowing from the sound of the carriage that he had gone off, went back again to her bedroom. It was her solitary refuge from the household cares which crowded upon her directly she went out from it. Even now, in the short time she had been in the nursery, the English governess and Matrona Filomonova had succeeded in putting several questions to her, which did not admit of delay, and which only she could answer. What were the children to put on for their walk? Should they have any milk? Should not a new cook be sent for? Ah, let me alone, let me alone, she said, and going back to her bedroom she sat down in the same place as she had sat when talking to her husband, clasping tightly her thin hands with the rings that slipped down on her bony fingers, and fell to going over in her memory all the conversation. He has gone. But has he broken it off with her? She thought. Can it be he sees her? Why didn't I ask him? No, no, reconciliation is impossible. Even if we remain in the same house, we are strangers, strangers forever. She repeated again with special significance the word so dreadful to her. And how I loved him! My God, how I loved him! How I loved him! And now don't I love him? Don't I love him more than before? The most horrible thing is, she began, but did not finish her thought, because Matrona Filomonova put her head in at the door. Let us send for my brother, she said, he can get a dinner anyway, or we shall have the children getting nothing to eat till 6 again, like yesterday. Very well, I will come directly and see about it. But did you send for some new milk? And Darya Alexandrovna plunged into the duties of the day, and drowned her grief in them for a time. Chapter 5. Stepan Arkadyevitch had learned easily at school, thanks to his excellent abilities, but he had been idle and mischievous, and therefore was one of the lowest in his class. But in spite of his habitually dissipated mode of life, his inferior grade in the service, and his comparative youth, he occupied the honorable and lucrative position of president of one of the government boards at Moscow. This post he had received through his sister Anna's husband, Alexei Alexandrovich Karenin, who held one of the most important positions in the ministry to whose department the Moscow office belonged. But if Karenin had not got his brother-in-law this berth, then through 100 other personages' brothers, sisters, cousins, uncles, and Aunt Stiva Oblonsky would have received this post, or some other similar one, together with the salary of 6,000 absolutely needful for him, as his affairs, in spite of his wife's considerable property, were in an embarrassed condition. Half Moscow and Petersburg were friends and relations of Stepan Arkadyevitch. He was born in the midst of those who had been and are the powerful ones of this world. 1/3 of the men in the government, the older men, had been friends of his father's, and had known him in petticoats, another third were his intimate chums, and the remainder were friendly acquaintances. Consequently, the distributors of earthly blessings in the shape of places, rents, shares, and such, were all his friends, and could not overlook one of their own set, and Oblonsky had no need to make any special exertion to get a lucrative post. He had only not to refuse things, not to show jealousy, not to be quarrelsome or take offense, all of which from his characteristic good nature he never did. It would have struck him as absurd if he had been told that he would not get a position with the salary he required, especially as he expected nothing out of the way. He only wanted what the men of his own age and standing did get, and he was no worse qualified for performing duties of the kind than any other man. Stepan Arkadyevitch was not merely liked by all who knew him for his good humor, but for his bright disposition, and his unquestionable honesty. In him, in his handsome, radiant figure, his sparkling eyes, black hair and eyebrows, and the white and red of his face, there was something which produced a physical effect of kindliness and good humor on the people who met him. Aha! Stiva Oblonsky! Here he is! Was almost always said with a smile of delight on meeting him. Even though it happened at times that after a conversation with him it seemed that nothing particularly delightful had happened, the next day, and the next, everyone was just as delighted at meeting him again. After filling for 3 years the post of president of one of the government boards at Moscow, Stepan Arkadyevitch had won the respect, as well as the liking, of his fellow officials, subordinates, and superiors, and all who had had business with him,